The defendant was apprehended stealing a loaf of bread from a neighborhood market, Your Honor, the prosecutor said, his tone icy and detached. Raymond just lowered his head. I only needed enough strength to get through one more day, he murmured. The courtroom let out a low ripple of laughter, but the judge didn't share it. He had just caught sight of the man's name. Who was this man, and what was it about that name that made the judge's eyes suddenly well up? Welcome to Uncovered Tales. Let's take a closer look at what truly happened. At 66, Raymond Ellis had become a familiar face in a Brooklyn neighborhood, living on the streets for over 10 years. Frail and aged, with a long silver beard that clearly hadn't seen a razor or scissors in ages, he was always seen carrying a battered military-style backpack, faded green, its straps worn and unraveling from years of use. Locals referred to him as the Quiet One. While many others experiencing homelessness begged for spare change or stirred up scenes, Raymond kept a low profile. He gathered recyclables, gratefully accepted scraps from kind-hearted restaurant workers, and made a point of sleeping in different spots each night so he wouldn't be a burden to any single storefront. What almost no one realized was that Raymond had served in the U.S. Army for over 2 decades. He was honorably discharged in 2004. 4 years later, in 2008, his wife, Clara, passed away from cancer, a diagnosis the VA hospital had initially gotten wrong. Her death sent Raymond into a deep emotional spiral. He pushed away his remaining family, sold their modest home, donated every last dollar to Clara's favorite charity, and vanished into the vast anonymity of New York City streets. Being nobody hurts less than living as someone who failed the person they loved most, he once confided to a soup kitchen volunteer. One freezing November afternoon, with snow on the horizon and temperatures already below zero, Raymond stepped into Levin's corner market. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. His hands trembled as he quietly tucked a day-old loaf of bread into his coat while Mr. Levin assisted another customer. What he didn't know was that Mr. Levin had recently upgraded the store's security system with new mirrors. "Hey! Don't move!" Levin shouted, already dialing the police. "I'm calling the cops." Raymond didn't bolt. He stayed right where he was, the loaf still visible through the half-zipped front of his coat. "I just needed enough to make it through the day," he said quietly. Police arrived just minutes later. The younger of the 2 responding officers, Officer Davis, looked uneasy as he placed the handcuffs around Raymond's thin, weathered wrists. "You're actually a vet?" Davis asked, eyeing the dog tags resting on Raymond's chest. "This ID is worn nearly smooth." Raymond nodded. "I used to be someone who mattered." "Not anymore." "I'm sorry, sir," Davis said gently. "The store owner's pressing charges. Says this isn't your first offense." Raymond was booked at the precinct just like any other shoplifter. A public defender gave him a brief, impersonal consultation, clearly more interested in clearing the docket than understanding who Raymond actually was. A court appearance was scheduled for the very next morning. The following day, Raymond was led into the courtroom at Brooklyn Municipal, still wearing the same rumpled clothes from the night before. No relatives were in attendance. No friends or character witnesses stood up for him. Just a handful of lawyers, a few reporters covering more high-profile cases, and court staff carrying out their daily routines. Case 47,293, The State vs. Raymond Ellis, the clerk read out in a flat voice. A young prosecutor stood and straightened his tie before speaking. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a loaf of bread. Given his history of petty theft and his lack of a permanent address, we recommend that he remain in custody until trial." Presiding over the bench was Judge Jonathan Whitaker, a man with a reputation for tough, no-nonsense rulings and little patience for courtroom drama. He barely glanced at Raymond before flipping open the case file. Like most of the people in the room, he had already written this case off as just another day, just another name. "Mr. Ellis, how do you plead?" Judge Whitaker asked, finally looking up from the file. "Guilty, Your Honor," Raymond replied, voice barely audible. "I was just hungry." Someone in the back chuckled. The judge looked up sharply and fixed a hard glare in their direction before turning back to the paperwork. Raymond Edward Ellis, former Staff Sergeant. United States Army. The judge's voice trailed off mid-sentence. The courtroom quieted as his face changed. He gripped the edge of the bench tightly, his knuckles whitening. He stared at Raymond. Then the file. Then back at Raymond again. Then, without saying a word, Judge Whitaker stood. The courtroom froze. Judges didn't stand. Not during preliminary hearings like this. He stood motionless for several seconds, his face tight with something unspoken, shock, grief, maybe both. "Your Honor," the prosecutor asked hesitantly, unsure how to proceed. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, Judge Whitaker said, his voice noticeably hoarse. "The defendant will remain seated." As the judge disappeared into his chambers, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Raymond didn't move. He sat motionless, eyes glued to the floor, either unaware of the ripple his name had caused, or simply too used to being overlooked to care. Inside his private chambers, Judge Jonathan Whitaker reached into a drawer and pulled out an old, creased photograph, a group of soldiers in desert camouflage standing in front of a makeshift medical tent in Iraq. His hands trembled as he studied the faces. There he was, 2 decades younger, a field medic before he ever stepped foot in law school. And beside him, standing tall in the back row, was Raymond Ellis. Turning to his computer, Judge Whitaker accessed the military database he still had clearance to use through his previous work with Veterans Affairs. A few keystrokes later, Raymond Ellis's service history filled the screen, and it confirmed everything the judge was beginning to remember. Staff Sergeant Ellis had completed 3 combat tours, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, serving in logistics. His job had been to get essential supplies through hostile territory to forward operating bases during the most dangerous moments of the war. In 2003, after his convoy was attacked, Raymond had earned the Bronze Star for valor. Instead of ducking for cover like most would have, he climbed into a burning fuel truck and drove it away from a group of wounded troops, sustaining serious injuries but saving 17 lives in the process. Also included in the file was a striking image that once graced the front page of the New York Times, Raymond carrying a wounded Afghan child toward a waiting medevac chopper. For a brief time, that photograph made him a symbol of American decency amid the brutality of war. And then, like so many others, the public moved on. But one document in particular made the judge's breath catch, a declassified mission report from July 2003. During a frantic retreat under enemy fire, Raymond had hoisted an injured medic onto his back and carried him 2 miles to safety, despite taking shrapnel to his own leg. That medic? Private First Class Jonathan Whitaker. "Oh my God," the judge whispered, barely believing the coincidence. "It's him." For years, Judge Whitaker had quietly searched for the man who'd saved his life. But after Raymond's discharge, he had vanished. No address. No updates. No trail, just the name Ellis, shouted above gunfire in the chaos of war. While the judge processed the weight of what he'd just discovered, Raymond remained alone in the courtroom. The bailiff barely looked up from his phone. To the system, Raymond was just another forgotten face. After Clara's death, Raymond had unraveled. The grief was crushing, intensified by untreated PTSD. The VA's initial misdiagnosis of her cancer had shattered his trust in the institutions he had once served without question. When she died, he let go of everything, their home, his pension, his identity. He couldn't bear to be part of the machine that had let her die. In the streets, Raymond became a ghost. Teenagers sometimes pelted him with food for fun. Store owners sprayed down the sidewalk to keep him from sleeping near their doors. Police officers nudged him along whenever neighbors complained. Even other homeless individuals avoided him, especially after they'd heard him screaming in the night from dreams that wouldn't let go. He survived by collecting recyclables, just enough to afford cough syrup when winter left him wheezing. He never begged. He never asked for pity. His military background had ingrained a sense of self-reliance that held on, even as everything else fell apart. And on the darkest days, he'd pull out the photo of Clara he kept sealed in a plastic sleeve to protect it from rain and grime. "Almost there, Maggie," he'd whisper to it, using her nickname. "Just holding on a little longer." Back in his office, Judge Whittaker sprang into action. His first call was to the VA, demanding immediate confirmation of Raymond's records. Then he phoned Nathan Briggs, now a colonel, the man who had served with both of them in Iraq. "Briggs, it's Whittaker. I found him. The guy who dragged me out of Fallujah. He's sitting in my courtroom right now, homeless, arrested for stealing a loaf of bread." There was a long pause on the other end before Briggs finally spoke. "I'll be there in 3 hours. Don't let him leave." The judge didn't waste another second. He grabbed his stationery and scrawled a note by hand on official letterhead. "Raymond Ellis is not just another homeless man. He represents a kind of loyalty this country has far too often forgotten. By law, he couldn't dismiss the case himself, not with this level of personal involvement. But that didn't mean he couldn't change the course of how this case unfolded." As the recess drew to a close, the judge's clerk returned to her desk and noticed a document she hadn't seen before. It was a printed copy of that iconic newspaper photo, Raymond carrying the Afghan child. Beneath it, in familiar handwriting, was a note. "Some heroes never ask to be remembered." She immediately recognized the signature. Colonel Briggs. She had seen his correspondence before in past veteran-related court filings. The pieces were finally falling into place. Raymond Ellis wasn't just another defendant. He was a man whose quiet courage had rippled through lives, including the lives of those who now held his fate in their hands. When court came back into session, Raymond sensed something had changed. Judge Whittaker no longer wore the same guarded expression. That cool, professional mask had lifted, replaced by something else. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe even reverence. Before Raymond could fully register the shift, the hearing took a surprising turn. In light of new developments related to the defendant's background, Judge Whittaker began, his voice measured but heavy with emotion. "The court is postponing proceedings until a full investigation can be completed. The defendant will remain in custody until tomorrow's hearing." The prosecutor looked briefly puzzled but didn't raise any objection. Raymond simply nodded, quietly accepting the decision. He was used to decisions being made about his life without explanation. This moment didn't feel any different, yet. As the officers began leading Raymond away, Judge Whittaker called out one final instruction. "Make sure Mr. Ellis gets a real meal, and see that he receives proper medical attention." That evening, the story broke online. A small local news blog posted a skeptical headline that immediately stirred controversy. "Homeless man claims to be war hero. Judge stalls sentencing over stolen bread." Within hours, the comments section was overflowing with harsh opinions and disbelief. Just another vagrant pretending to be a veteran. If he actually served, why isn't he getting benefits from the VA instead of stealing food? Meanwhile, in the county holding facility, Raymond felt the impact of that public skepticism firsthand. A younger inmate, scrolling through the article on a smuggled phone, glared at him with contempt. "Stolen valor is the lowest thing a person can do," the young man spat, shoving Raymond hard against the concrete wall. "My brother died over there, while people like you wear fake dog tags for sympathy." Raymond didn't retaliate. He didn't raise a hand or a word in his defense. He simply absorbed the shove the same way he'd learned to endure society's indifference, with quiet resignation. Later that night, he left the hot meal untouched. Instead, he sat silently on his cot, clutching his military dog tags in one hand and Clara's photo in the other, her smile worn soft by years of handling. And for the first time in what felt like forever, a question stirred inside him. Why now? Why had someone finally looked at him, and truly seen him? Have you ever watched someone be completely misjudged, just based on how they looked or where they came from? Maybe now is the time to share that story. Someone out there might really need to hear it. The next morning, Raymond was escorted back into the courtroom, unaware that everything had changed overnight. This time, the gallery was packed. Every seat was taken. The atmosphere crackled with quiet anticipation. News crews had gathered outside, cameras ready, though they weren't allowed inside. Still, everyone knew something unusual was coming. As Raymond shuffled toward the defense table, he noticed a small but significant detail: his public defender was gone. In their place stood a dignified older man with silver hair and an air of quiet authority. "I'm Gerald Monroe," he said gently. "I represent the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. Someone's taken a serious interest in your case, Mr. Ellis." Raymond looked at him, confused. Monroe didn't explain further. He just gave a reassuring nod and gestured for him to sit. As Raymond settled into his chair, the courtroom doors opened again. The room stood as Judge Whitaker entered, but Raymond's attention shifted to the trio of sharply dressed military officers who followed closely behind the court officers. They wore full-dress uniforms, their medals gleaming under the overhead lights. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Jonathan Whitaker," the bailiff announced. Everything about the room felt different now. The tension. The energy. The judge himself looked changed, his expression no longer distant and rigid, but deeply personal. "Before we proceed with the charges against Mr. Ellis," Judge Whitaker began, "this court will first hear testimony relevant to the defendant's background, as it may significantly impact these proceedings." Raymond blinked in surprise as Colonel Nathan Briggs stepped forward and took the witness stand. Though older now, his posture was still upright, his presence unmistakably military. After being sworn in, he addressed the courtroom with clear, deliberate authority. "My name is Colonel Nathan Briggs. I'm currently stationed at Fort Hamilton. I've known Staff Sergeant Raymond Ellis since our deployment to Iraq in 2003. He paused, then turned to look directly at Raymond. "This man saved the lives of 17 of our soldiers when our convoy was ambushed near Fallujah. Under heavy fire, he got behind the wheel of a burning fuel truck and drove it away from our position. He suffered second-degree burns in the process, but his actions prevented a massive explosion that would have killed everyone on that road." A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery, but Briggs wasn't done. Later that same day, Staff Sergeant Ellis carried an injured medic, Private First Class Jonathan Whitaker, 2 miles through hostile terrain, even though he had shrapnel embedded in his leg. All eyes snapped to the bench. Judge Whitaker's usually composed face cracked for a brief second. He gave a silent nod, confirming every word. The prosecutor stood, his discomfort obvious. "Your Honor, while Colonel Briggs's testimony certainly speaks to the defendant's past, the fact remains that Mr. Ellis committed theft." "If I may continue," Briggs said, calmly but firmly. "During our review of Mr. Ellis's service records, we uncovered a significant administrative mistake. In 2008, during a database migration, his benefits and pension were mistakenly terminated. The VA had sent paperwork to an outdated address. He never received it. Since then, Mr. Ellis has been entitled to $1,370 a month in pension, along with full medical coverage for his service-related injuries. That's over 15 years of unpaid benefits, amounting to more than $246,000. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. At the defense table, Raymond sat stunned. His hands, scarred and calloused, clenched the edge of the table for grounding. "And there's more," Briggs added, producing a folder. "Inside are signed affidavits from 5 of his former unit members, each affirming his integrity, his bravery, and his leadership. Included is a personal letter from General Geralds, whose son, Lieutenant Michael Geralds, was also among those saved during that same ambush." Judge Whitaker finally turned to Raymond, and for the first time during the entire hearing, his voice softened. "Mr. Ellis, would you please come forward?" Raymond rose hesitantly, uncertainty written all over his face. Slowly, he approached the bench, not yet understanding the full gravity of what was unfolding. The judge's voice was firm, but emotion lingered just beneath the surface. Normally, I'd be required to recuse myself from any case involving a personal connection, he began. But I didn't recognize you yesterday. It wasn't until I read through your service record that I realized, you were the one who saved my life all those years ago in Iraq. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, every head turning toward Raymond. Removing his glasses, Judge Whitaker's expression softened, the formal barrier between them crumbling. I've spent nearly 20 years searching for the man who carried me out of that firefight. I only ever knew your last name, Ellis, shouted through the noise of war. When Raymond finally spoke, his voice was gravelly, worn from disuse. I was just doing what I was trained to do, sir. No, the judge said, shaking his head. You went far beyond your duty. And this country has failed in its duty to you. Turning to the prosecutor, Judge Whitaker's tone grew steady again. Given these extraordinary circumstances, does the state intend to move forward with prosecution? The young prosecutor, now visibly affected by what had unfolded, stood and nodded with respect. Your Honor, the state formally moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Ellis, with prejudice. The judge wasted no time. So ordered, he declared. Mr. Ellis, you are hereby released. On behalf of this court, and this country, I offer you a sincere apology for the years of injustice you've endured. Raymond remained still, the weight of the moment sinking in. He stood there, stunned, as if unsure how to respond. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened once more. A woman in her 30s stepped inside, scanning the room with tear-filled eyes. When she spotted Raymond, she moved quickly toward him. Uncle Raymond, she whispered. It's me, Abigail. Clara's niece. We've been trying to find you for so long. Whatever strength Raymond had held on to cracked then. His shoulders dropped, and as Abigail wrapped her arms around him, he let himself be held, his first embrace in years that didn't come with cuffs or cold suspicion. Outside, the story had already exploded. Colonel Briggs, facing a wall of microphones, made a firm and poignant statement. This isn't just about one man, he said. This is about thousands of veterans like Raymond Ellis, who've been abandoned by a system they once risked everything to protect. Today, we start changing that. By the time the sun set, the internet had already claimed the story. Videos from inside the courtroom went viral. News helicopters circled above the courthouse as Raymond stepped outside, clean-shaven, dressed in freshly donated clothes, flanked on either side by Colonel Briggs and Judge Whitaker, no longer presiding, but present as a grateful private citizen. Even Mr. Levin, the store owner who had originally filed charges, pushed through the crowd. I didn't know who you were, he said, voice shaking. All I saw was a man causing trouble. I never imagined. I'm ashamed. Raymond looked at him for a long moment. He didn't speak. He just gave a small nod, too overwhelmed to find words. Within 2 days, a National Veterans Foundation created a support fund in Raymond's name. Donations came pouring in. In less than 48 hours, it had already surpassed $200,000. Social media lit up with stories, other veterans, other families, each echoing the same theme: this could have been my dad, my brother, my sister, my friend. The pressure mounted quickly, and by the week's end, the VA had announced a sweeping review of all previously terminated benefits cases. Later, away from the press and noise, Judge Whitaker finally got the private moment he'd waited decades for. You carried me over 2 miles that day, he said softly, looking Raymond in the eye. Shrapnel in your leg. You didn't even let the medics treat you until they stabilized me. Raymond shrugged, like it was no big deal. You were in worse shape. The judge smiled faintly. You said something to me that day. I never forgot it. I was slipping in and out, and you told me, just keep breathing, kid. Your story's not over. He paused, his voice catching for a moment. Those words stayed with me. They kept me fighting. They got me through recovery. They're the reason I became a judge. I wanted to spend my life helping others the way you helped me. Raymond didn't reply right away. He just studied the judge for a moment, not as a man in a robe, but as the young medic he had once hauled through gunfire. I'm glad something good came out of it, he finally said. It wasn't just something good, Whitaker replied, his tone gentle. Everything I have, my career, my family, the chance to make a difference, it all exists because you didn't leave me behind. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Raymond smiled. A real one. One that lit up his eyes. No man left behind, he said, almost to himself. That wasn't just a saying to me. 3 days later, Raymond returned to the courthouse, but this time, not as a defendant. He stood in Judge Whitaker's chambers wearing a crisp new suit. Across his chest, his long-overdue military honors gleamed, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and a row of ribbons that told a silent story of courage, pain, and loyalty. A representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs handed him a formal check, compensation for years of lost pension, plus an additional settlement for the administrative failure that had taken more than just money from him. It had taken his dignity, his stability, his place in the world. As cameras clicked and reporters leaned in, Raymond cleared his throat to speak. I don't want anyone's pity, Raymond said, his voice steady. I just hope that those who come after me aren't left behind the way I was. What began as a quiet courtroom moment quickly ignited a nationwide discussion about the treatment of America's veterans. Raymond's story was cited in congressional hearings. His name appeared in proposed legislation aimed at overhauling the VA benefits system. That powerful photograph, Raymond carrying the wounded Afghan child, resurfaced online. But this time, it was paired with a stark contrast, an image of him sitting alone on a Brooklyn sidewalk, wrapped in a worn jacket, forgotten by the system he once served. The side-by-side images struck a nerve. A single, unspoken question echoed across the country: how did we let this happen? Raymond Ellis, long invisible to the world around him, had suddenly become a symbol no one could ignore. 6 months later, Raymond moved into Veterans Village, a supportive housing community not far from where he once wandered the streets. The small apartment, modest but warm, was the first real home he'd had since Clara passed. His belongings were few, but one wall stood out, a quiet tribute lined with framed photos. Clara smiling in her wedding dress. His squad in Iraq. And a new addition, him standing beside Judge Whitaker at a veterans recognition ceremony. Though he turned down most requests for interviews, Raymond accepted invitations to speak at local schools. He didn't dramatize his story, nor did he soften the hard parts. He simply told the truth, about service, sacrifice, and what happens after the headlines fade. Teenagers who rarely listened in class leaned forward in their seats when he spoke. He didn't preach. He didn't perform. He just spoke plainly, from a place of lived experience. Every afternoon, Raymond could be found on a bench in Prospect Park, watching kids laugh and play. Sometimes it was the very same bench he'd curled up on during bitter winters. Now, it was a quiet place of reflection, a seat of peace instead of survival. Outside the Brooklyn courthouse, a new bronze plaque was unveiled. Its inscription read, "Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten." Beside the words, a sculpted relief showed Raymond in uniform, carrying a wounded soldier through chaos, Judge Whitaker himself, framed by the American flag. During the dedication, the mayor stepped forward to make an announcement: the city would be launching a permanent legal fund for homeless veterans. It would be called the Ellis Initiative. Later that year, a 10-year-old boy who had once watched Raymond collect bottles wrote a heartfelt essay for his school's newspaper. His words were simple, but powerful. Not everyone in torn clothes is bad. Some people wear memories instead. The essay won first place in a citywide competition and was read aloud at a local government meeting focused on addressing homelessness. Raymond stayed in touch with Judge Whitaker. The two met from time to time, and occasionally, Raymond would join the judge's family for Sunday dinner. During one visit, the judge's son, wide-eyed with curiosity, asked a question that hung in the air. Mr. Ellis, aren't you mad about being homeless all those years? Raymond took a breath, then answered quietly, no, not mad. I just want those who come next to remember the ones who came before. On Veterans Day, Raymond stood tall at Fort Hamilton, dressed in full uniform once again. Before a crowd of civilians, service members, and fellow veterans, he stepped to the microphone. I once stood to defend this country, he said. And now, after all this time, the country has stood up for me. He paused, then added with quiet strength. Kindness isn't always fast. But it's never too late. It just takes someone willing to wait long enough. As he stepped away from the podium, a stillness filled the air. Then, without a word, the entire crowd rose to their feet in silent salute. Young recruits, seasoned commanders, and aging veterans all stood with one shared gesture of respect. Raymond returned the salute. His gaze was steady. His spine straight. He no longer looked down at the concrete beneath his feet. Now, his eyes were lifted, focused on the road ahead. Because justice, though it may take its time, never truly disappears. Keep doing what's right, even when no one seems to notice. The world catches up eventually. Have you ever stood your ground when no one else did? Share that moment. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Uncovered Tales, where truth, resilience, and justice are never forgotten.